Psycho. Psychotherapy is a myth. Psychotherapeutic interventions are metaphorical treatments that stand in the same relation to medical treatments as editing television programs stand to repairing television sets. Psychotherapy is a metaphor. For example, calling advising persons how to manage their spouses marriage therapy because it looks like advising them how to manage their diabetes is an instance of psychotherapy as a phenomenal metaphor. Calling imprisoning persons hospitalization to justify it as a psychiatric intervention is an instance of psychotherapy as a strategic metaphor. As mental illness is not something the patient has in his body or mind, but something he does, especially what he says. So psychotherapy is not something the therapist has to give the patient, but something he does, especially with and about the patient. Architects design houses, not homes. Homes are what people create or fail to create out of their houses. Similarly, psychotherapists provide conversations, not cures. Cures of souls, now called successful psychotherapies, are what clients who engage in such conversations create or fail to create out of their contacts with psychotherapists. The psychotherapist, who calls his conversations with clients patient interviews and tape records them, is like the traveler who calls strange places and people tourist attractions and natives and photographs them. Each puts a technological barrier, a gadget, between himself and his own experience, thus attenuating or killing it, while at the same time telling himself that he is trying to preserve it for more perfect future recall. But by objectifying and recording his experience, each destroys precisely that which ostensibly he tries to preserve. As one man's meat is another man's poison, so one man's psychotherapy is another man's psychopathology. Psychotherapists used to be called mental healers, which raises the question, are mental healers like brain healers, that is, neurologists and neurosurgeons, or like faith healers, that is, ministers, engaged in the cure of souls, and charlatans, selling the proverbial snake oil? Psychiatrists claim that medical psychotherapists are brain healers. I maintain that they are faith healers. Whether they are charlatans or not depends on what they do and claim they do. The term psychotherapy denotes diverse principles and practices of ethics couched in the idiom of treatment. Each reflects the aspirations and values of its practitioners. Classifying psychotherapies according to what the therapist expects from the patient, we can distinguish three general types. 1. Compassionate therapy, the therapist expecting improvement and gratitude, get well. 2. Commanding therapy, the therapist expecting obedience and awe, do what I tell you. 3. Contractual therapy, the therapist expecting payment and reciprocity, listen to yourself, trust yourself, and I shall try to help you change your life if and as you want it changed. People seeking help from psychotherapists can be divided into two groups: those who wish to confront their problems and change their lives by changing themselves, and those who wish to avoid the inevitable consequences of their life strategies through therapy. The former are likely to benefit from therapy in a short time. The latter are likely to mark time for years or even decades and sink ever deeper into their self-created existential morass. Samuel Butler began to write The Way of All Flesh in 1872 and completed it in 1884, about the same time that Sigmund Freud began to show interest in psychotherapy, and some 10 years before the publication of Breuer and Freud's studies on hysteria. In the following passage, Butler anticipates what we now call the medical model of mental illness and psychotherapy. Rome has reduced the treatment of the human soul to a science, while our own church, though so much purer in many respects, has no organized system either of diagnosis or pathology. I mean, of course, spiritual diagnosis and spiritual pathology. Our church does not prescribe remedies upon any settled system, and what is still worse, even when her physicians have according to their lights ascertained the disease and pointed out the remedy, she has no discipline which will ensure its being actually applied. If our patients do not choose to do as we tell them, we cannot make them. Perhaps really under all the circumstances, this is as well, for we are spiritually mere horse doctors as compared with the Roman priesthood. Either the priest is indeed a spiritual guide, as being able to show people how they ought to live better than they can find out themselves, or he is nothing at all. He has no raison d'etre. If the priest is not as much a healer and director of men's souls as a physician is of their bodies, what is he? The history of all ages has shown that as men cannot cure the bodies of their patients if they have not been properly trained in hospitals under skilled teachers, so neither can souls be cured of their more hidden ailments without the help of men who are skilled in soulcraft, or in other words, of priests. As for men curing themselves, they can no more cure their own souls than they can cure their own bodies or manage their own law affairs. In these last two cases, they see the folly of meddling with their own cases clearly enough and go to a professional advisor as a matter of course. Surely a man's soul is at once a more difficult and intricate matter to treat. And at the same time, it is more important to him that it should be treated rightly than that either his body or his money should be so. Butler used the medical model as an explicitly analogical device to explain the function of the priest as spiritual guide. Freud labored mightily and successfully to turn this analogy into an identity, that is, to define psychoanalysis as a literal treatment, except when it suited his political polemical purposes to disavow this transparent literalization of a metaphor. I have assumed that psychoanalysis is not a specialized branch of medicine. The words secular pastoral worker might well serve as a general formula for describing the function of the analyst. Nevertheless, Freud never stopped hoping that he would receive the Nobel Prize in Medicine, to which he felt fully entitled by his great discovery. Like a Renaissance pope preaching celibacy by day and sleeping with concubines at night, Freud preached strict adherence to analytic rules which he himself steadfastly violated. This sort of hypocrisy, which may well be a requirement for becoming a religious leader, ill becomes anyone who respects others, especially those who seek his help. A decent psychotherapist should set rules only for himself, which he should follow. If others want to emulate his behavior, that is their affair, not his. How others practice psychotherapy is none of his business, except as an observer of and commentator on the human condition. Indeed, why would a psychotherapist want to formulate rules for other therapists to follow? How would the successful propagation of such rules benefit him, except by aggrandizing him as a great rule-maker? But making rules for others is, par excellence, an enterprise in heteronomy, incompatible with advocating autonomy. The autonomous psychotherapist's role vis-a-vis his client is like the court jester's vis-a-vis the monarch. The therapist confronts the client with painful reality in as friendly a way as possible. The client retains complete control over whether or not he wants to listen to the therapist. People with personal problems often behave like the proverbial drunk who looks for his house key under the streetlight, not because that's where he dropped it, but because that's where the light is. Should such a person consult an autonomous psychotherapist, the therapist's job is not to try to find the key, but to suggest to the patient that he light a match or borrow a flashlight from a neighbor and go look for his key where he dropped it. Success in psychotherapy, that is, the ability to change oneself in a direction in which one wants to change, requires courage rather than insight. Hypnosis, two people lying to each other, each pretending to believe both his own and his partner's lies. For psychiatrists, mental illness is brain disease. For psychologists, behavioral disorder. For social workers, family or system problem. However much these mental health professionals might disagree on what they are treating, they all agree that psychotherapy is an effective therapeutic intervention and that their particular brand of it is the best. The most popular and financially successful psychotherapists in the United States today are the faith healers, the Oral Robertses, Jerry Falwells, Jim and Tammy Backers. Far more money pours into the coffers of clerical than clinical healers. Indeed, the clinician in the psychotherapy business is to the entrepreneur in the guru business as the chef in an elegant French restaurant is to the owner of a chain of fast food establishments. During the 1950s and 1960s, when psychoanalysis was fashionable, the title of a typical psychiatric article or lecture was The Psychodynamics of Depression. Today, when psychopharmacology is fashionable, a typical title is The Drug Treatment of Depression. Formerly, psychiatrists wanted to demonstrate the reason the patient is depressed. Now they want to demonstrate that there is no reason for him to be depressed. Then, insight was believed to be therapeutic for it. Now drugs are believed to be therapeutic for it. Is there a cure for depression? In the medical sense, no. In the existential sense, yes. When the person's depressing life situation improves because of his own actions or for any other reason, his depression will disappear. Before the Enlightenment, religious truth was accepted as a justification for coercion. Since then, psychiatric truth has been so regarded. The former view illustrates the mindset that sees controlling deviance in the name of God as unquestionably good. The latter illustrates the mindset that sees controlling deviance in the name of mental health in the same way. Let us keep in mind that we in the West have long repudiated the legitimacy of violence in the name of God. So long as we do not similarly repudiate the legitimacy of violence in the name of mental health, the terms psychiatric help and psychiatric reform will carry an impossible load of ambivalence, rendering them useless if not obscene. Voltaire said, "No priest should ever deprive a citizen of the least prerogative on the pretext that this citizen is a sinner, because the priest should pray for other sermers and not judge them." This maxim defines the role of the autonomous psychotherapist, who must abide by the principle that no psychotherapist should ever deprive a citizen of the least prerogative on the pretext that this citizen is mentally ill, because the psychotherapist should only listen and talk to his patients and not deprive them of liberty or responsibility. Legally, psychotherapeutic practices should be treated as sexual relations are. If the relationship is consensual, both or all parties engaging in it voluntarily, the therapy should be permissible. It is no one else's business whether the therapy is good or bad, helpful or unhelpful. On the other hand, if the relationship is coerced, the subject being forced to be a patient, then the therapy should be prohibited and the therapist punished as a criminal. The claim that the patient benefits from the therapy should not be accepted as a justification for subjecting him to it. In short, in a free society, there can be no valid objection to psychotherapy between consenting adults, nor can there be any valid defense of the therapeutic rape of the patient by the therapist. Psychiatrists are fond of reproaching me for the fact that, unlike them, I offer no help or refuse to help severely mentally ill or psychotic persons. This accusation implies that psychiatric coercion is legitimate and indeed praiseworthy, the paradigmatic claim of psychiatry that I reject. As a therapist, I try to help persons only if they want and seek my help, and my aim is always to try to help them become more free and responsible. Hence, I have nothing to offer persons who do not want my help or whose aim is to reject their freedom and coerce others to assume responsibility for them.